Hi, welcome to Ultimate Wildlife Gardens. My name's Chris Caligari. Now if you look at this face, you might get one strong impression, you might get a couple. No, not old and wrinkly and bald. I'm hoping that you might get the impression that I perhaps have a little bit of experience of ponds. So this video is about ponds in general, but particular emphasis on ponds and their value to wildlife. This is a deep dive, and the purpose of the video really is to try and cover some of the points which many videos on YouTube don't cover. There are some excellent pieces of work on there and very worthwhile, but the name of this channel is Ultimate Wildlife Gardens, so we really want to go rather deeper into it than many of the others do. Who is this video for? Well, it's for subscribers to whom I'm very grateful and many of whom are very knowledgeable. I very much hope that I will be able to add something to the knowledge and my experience of maintaining a pond. Where's this experience come from? Well, I started as an ecologist, teacher of environmental science, etc., but most of my working life has been as a garden designer, specialising in wildlife gardens. That goes back many, many years. I also employed a team of my own landscapers to install the ponds which I designed. Nearly all of the gardens which I designed had ponds and water features, so literally over the years, I hate to think back on it really, but I guess it runs into hundreds of ponds. Not only was I involved with constructing the ponds, but also to a certain extent the maintenance, because often I'd get called by clients that were having some sort of problems, perhaps there's a leak in the pond, perhaps the pond needed clearing, and so I've got a very wide range of experience. And the wrinkles, although I admit have very few benefits, perhaps indicates a degree of experience. So this video, I hope, will be of interest to anybody who has a pond or who's thinking of having a pond. I'm sure I don't need to, I'm stating the obvious if I say that ponds are a most marvellous thing to have in a garden or whatever area that you've got. Endlessly fascinating. A superb place to park a bench and a seat and a glass of wine at the end of the evening. There's always something going on. It's always interesting, but of course it is absolutely essential for wildlife. Where does this come in? Where does the importance come from? Well, I split it into two really. One is the direct benefits in that it provides a place where, I'm stating the obvious here, I'll skim over, as I'll try to on this video, all the obvious points, because you already know this. But as well as a breeding place for amphibians, frogs, toads, newts, etc., dragonflies, damselflies, they're all they will benefit greatly from having a pond, lovely to watch, and of course greatly increasing the habitat diversity of your garden. But I think more important, a point which is often missed or not emphasised sufficiently, is that there are lots of indirect benefits. So if we say yes, it's great, a pond is a place where many insects can breed, so we produce flying insects, and so of course we will feed bats. That's generally recognised, but it really is a ripple effect, and it absolutely is a starburst, because if you've got flying insects, then of course these will be food for not just bats, but the more inconspicuous things like spiders. They in turn will be fed on by tits in the garden, by wrens, by a wide range of species. So it's very, very important indeed. And also, if I say, a pond will greatly be of benefit to birds of prey, not quite so obvious, but absolutely vital, because grass snakes, for example, feed on young frogs. And my own philosophy is that we have to accept, if we want a wildlife garden, that natural processes go on. So these small frogs, favourite food of grass snakes, don't throw your hands up and say, oh, grass snakes, perfectly harmless, lovely, wonderful things, a vital part of the biodiversity of our country. But they're a very popular food for birds of prey. And so, yes, spawn is produced in vast quantities because the young frogs are consumed in vast quantities by such things as the grass snakes. But the grass snakes, in many areas, are an important food for our birds of prey. So it really is a starburst effect, and the indirect benefits of a pond are really huge. We mustn't underestimate that. Right, so we can say that it's no problem. We obviously recognise that ponds are immensely valuable for our wildlife and a wonderful place to sit and enjoy the wildlife. But where do you put the pond? You might only have a very small garden, in which case setting in something like a half barrel can itself be a huge resource for wildlife. I established one once in a particular garden I'm thinking of. I've done it many times, but one particular garden I'm thinking of, it was only a half barrel, and the garden, it was fairly enclosed with walls round, and it was started off with a little bit of frog spawn was put into it, and I went back to it after many years, and the number of frogs in that garden was difficult to believe. It was hugely successful, just from this one half barrel. It was a secluded spot, so there weren't many predators, but the frogs, of course, were produced in far bigger quantities than that garden could support, but of course they would have spread out from that area. Point simple. Even if you only have the space for a very small pond, don't think you can't have one. If you've got more space, where are you going to put it? Siting. It's ideal if it's levelish. It makes life so much easier. It's also ideal if you can. We're talking ideals, but things don't always work out ideally. If you can, try not to have it too close to trees. The shading, or partial shading, is no problem at all. In fact, it can be a benefit, because I'll touch on it later on, but blanket weed is always a bit of a snag with ponds. It takes a bit of management. But if you cut down the light by shade of buildings or something for at least part of the day, so it doesn't get the full sun all day, that will help with blanket weed control. As I say, things aren't always ideal, and in my last wildlife garden, I had to position the pond quite close to beneath an oak tree. And of course I had a slight leaf problem there, because you don't want too many leaves going into it. Again, I'll touch on later on in the video how I managed with that, because that doesn't exclude you having a pond. So ideally levelish, ideally not too close to trees, which are going to cause you problems with the leaves. Some people will object or be put off from having a pond because of dangers to children. I have quite a strong view on that, and that is that if that is thought to be a problem, then a simple picket fence around it with a decent gate and a lock can deal with that. If the children are so big that they can overcome or climb over the fence or something, well, the pond isn't likely to be a big danger to them anyway. And you can make it a little bit shallower for safety reasons. But generally speaking, I've grown up with ponds. Most of us have grown up with ponds in the area, and a world which is totally devoid of all safety aspects, of all risks, etc., I think is a pretty dull world. I think the ponds, the benefits far outweigh the detractions, because as a resource for children, it is an absolutely wonderful, endlessly fascinating area. So I would say, if you're worried, then something like a picket fence around it should deal with that. Right, the idea of this video is to cover a lot of ground without boring you to tears and to keep it bouncing along. So, we've established that ponds are hugely important. We've established that even if you've got a very small garden, there's scope for a pond. Let's start talking about the actual construction and the building of it. If in doubt, I would say use a garden hose or a cord or something to form an outline and see how big a pond you can make. In general, be generous. It is a lot of work in digging out a pond, but it's something which will be virtually permanent. So once you've done it, it'll give you pleasure, huge joy for many years to come, and even for generations to come. So it's a really worthwhile thing to do, and it's worth putting in the effort and making something worthwhile. Now let's talk about the actual nitty-gritty building the pond. Again, I'm going to skim very briefly over this because many excellent YouTube videos already show you clips of people digging ponds, etc. Let's just deal with the principles and make sure we've got the principles right. Right, so we've decided where we're going to put our pond. We've decided on the size and the shape. So let's say we decide we're going to go for just an oval like this, and we decide that it'd be rather nice if we have a pebble area, a shallow area at one end. That really is pretty well essential for wildlife to be able to get in and out of the pond, birds to bathe. We marked it in cross section. Let's assume that our land is fairly levelish. I'd start by digging down about a foot over the entire area of the pond. Initially, the turf on top here, I'll take that off. If you have a sloping site, then the turf can be really useful, because what you can do is use the turf to build up a turf bank. And then the soil that you're digging out here below the turf can go in there and use it for levelling. The turf is useful to form this bank because it will knit together very quickly indeed to give you a substantial bank. And let's face it, a turf bank, it's going to be another habitat. I've used turf banks on occasions, very popular with ants and some other creatures, so it's just another form of habitat diversity, and it overcomes the problem. You're levelling the pond, it won't sink that much, so it's quite a useful thing to do. Below that, it will depend on where you are, but below the topsoil, which you'll have put to raise the level for yourself, or spread it on the garden, but you then come to a layer of, and it varies from place to place. Sometimes the topsoil is very deep, sometimes it's shallow, but when you get to the subsoil, that can be quite useful, and that I would stack up on one side, because you might want to use that during the construction process. Right, so having taken the turf off, and you excavate round about a foot in depth, and that is basically going to give you your planting shelf. Now it depends what sort of pond you're going to make next, but round about a foot in from that, it might be more depending on the pond type, but let's say a foot in on both sides. Then you'll dig down again, and this is the sump of the pond. This is where you're going to create the depth, and this is probably where your subsoil is going to come from. The idea being that when you have finished and you've got your pond like this, then this is the area that you'll be able to put your planting baskets in, which are plastic mesh baskets which you can get from the DIY superstores, the garden centres. They're widely sold, and this is where your marginal plants can grow. If it's something that likes to be fully submerged, then it can sit on this shelf. If it's something which just likes, should we say, its feet in the water, then this planting shelf, you can put a brick on it, and then this basket, plant pot, whatever you use. If we say the finished pond level is going to be something like that, then you can have, this can be an area for something like marsh marigolds. Ideally your natives, it might be your purple loosestrife. There's a wide variety of plants, and you can adjust the height that they sit in the water. It's a very good thing to have these marginal plants around the edge. So that's what I would call basically the normal sort of pond that I would use as a commercial landscaper using a pond liner, but of course there are other alternatives. Number one, which I haven't come across for donkey's years, I don't use it now, that's a preformed fiberglass liner. I haven't seen them around for donkey's years, but perhaps I don't go to the right places. They used to work quite well. Basically, you just dig out your hole to shape, line the sand, lower the preformed liner in, and they used to work perfectly well. I'm not going to spend any longer on it than that. Some people do concrete liners. Now for me, as a commercial landscaper, it was never really, I did occasionally do it, but there are problems. It's always tends to be prone to cracking, and so really it needs reinforcing with mesh. And the other big snag is that because of the highly caustic nature of the concrete, when it's done, it has to be given time to cure and then treated with something to make it impermeable to the water, to stop the alkaline salts coming out of the cement. They're very, very toxic, and they'll kill anything on contact. So that's a real problem. For me, concrete is possible, but not anything that I would do these days. Lastly, the greenest solution, which does fit sometimes, but I've never done it myself, and that is to use clay. If you happen to be in an area where you've got a very clay subsoil, then it can be a very practical solution. It's very green because you're using just local materials, or you can indeed bring the clay in. It has to be done carefully. It takes a lot of clay. I believe, as I say, I've not done it, but I think it takes something like a 6-inch to 12-inch thick layer of clay, which is basically compacted down, paddled down, and it will last forever, virtually forever anyway. But it's been used for hundreds of years, and it does work well, as long as it's not allowed to dry out, in which case it will crack. But it does work very, very well. It's green, it's an excellent solution, but I would say only really if you happen to be in a clay area, or you're very dedicated and you can haul the clay from somewhere and you can get it. Right, that's just for completeness. for practical landscaping purposes, a butyl or similar liner, I think, is the way to go. Right, that form of pond I would describe as the classic type of pond, and generally as a landscaper, as a practical landscaper, that's the sort of form of pond that I would use. But there are alternatives, and one that well, there's two actually that I particularly like, which I'll just briefly describe, and that is ground level, gently sloping, and then your what we call sump, the deep part of the pond, will be something like that. Now what you can do is use the subsoil to put a layer of subsoil in the bottom here to form a cushion, and then pile rocks up like this. And the idea is that you build a wall effectively down here, and then you use your subsoil. I'll just change the colour because I can. And your subsoil you'll pile up like this. This wall, the purpose of course, is to stop the soil from washing back in. Now this gives you a nice shallow area made up of your subsoil, and you can plant straight into it. Obviously, I'm stating the totally obvious thing, that you must not use anything in the way of tools, but it's when it's loose subsoil put in, then of course you can just plant straight into it, and you've got a very wide range of depths, and you can produce, I would call this a very naturalistic type of pond, where the vegetation is giving you a very gradual transition from plants of dry land into those that like to have their feet in the water, to those that like to be fully submerged, and then this area here in the sump is obviously an ideal area for planting your water lilies. And that will give you quite a nice degree of shading. I ought to just mention, I'm sure it's well known to many of you, that blanket weed is a nuisance, and blanket weed loves lots of nutrients in the water. So the reason that we're using subsoil is because it's the layer below your topsoil. It will be fairly low in organic matter. It should, with luck, it won't increase the nutrient status of the water too much, which the blanket weed loves. So it's quite a useful way of doing it. One other variation, which is the one that I have used in my own garden, just get rid of this sheet, is a similar idea. So I've got my pond, I've got a wide planting shelf down into my deep sump, but I have piled stones, built effectively a stone wall like this. So the liner, if we say the black line here, represents the liner. Water level is here, and this is the one that I have, I suppose, evolved over the years and it provides, the wall of course is purely dry laid. I wouldn't use any mortar or anything like that, but it provides lots of little gaps and spaces for the creatures to live in, and it gives you a very pleasing look to the pond. It looks very naturalistic. Then I use planting baskets, again for my plants, on a brick to raise them up if I don't want too much depth. And this works very well indeed. If you haven't got access to, I was lucky, I've got stone because I demolished a shed near the site, but if you haven't got stone, then there are other alternatives. On my last wildlife garden, I used brick, pile dry, obviously staggered joints, and built the walls up with that. It's best to use a very hard brick, like an engineering brick, because what tends to happen is with the frost, you will get some what they call, the builders call spalling. You'll get the bricks where they'll start to lose the face, etc. They will break down, which isn't the end of the world. You could also use something like paving slabs, broken paving slabs, something like that. The principle is the same. It's excellent for the wildlife, it looks attractive, and it's my chosen option for my own pond here. Those are the basic types of pond. I'll just skim briefly now onto the liners. I'm concentrating on this video largely on the use of pond liners because for many of us it's a very good solution. Are they green? No, far from it. Heavily reliant for production on petrochemicals, generally speaking, but bearing in mind the fact that they do exist and they are very, very cost effective, and once you've installed it, it should last for many, many years. Often they're guaranteed for 25 or more years, and they should do better than that. So that they're very, very long term. The one overriding thing which I would say is don't skimp on the liner. It's very tempting when you see the cost of them, because they are very expensive items. It can be very tempting to economise, but be careful, because you want to do this to get a lifetime's work out of it. And generally speaking, I'll use a thick liner and I will bite the bullet and pay what it takes. On the same principle, you want it to last, so it's worth doing really well. When you've excavated your site, it really is very, very important. You want to get the pond finished and filled and enjoy it, but it's worth taking the time, going over your excavation, checking for stones, anything sharp, and even things like roots which you might have cut, to make sure they haven't got sharp ends. Check your site first. I would then blind the site with sand to provide a nice soft area which I can guarantee is going to be free from bits of broken glass, sharp stones, anything which is potentially going to harm the liner. I then always use a material which lines the hole on top of the sand, which protects the liner. It's tough, it's a matting, and generally speaking, you'll be able to buy that from wherever you buy your liner. It's not that expensive, but I think it's worth it. Is it essential? Probably not. But all the steps that I've mentioned here, I would always do on my own pond or for a client's pond, because it's a lot of work, it's a big investment, of time, effort, money, you want to get it right. So I don't skimp on any of those things. I do my absolute utmost. And so therefore, if, for example, I'm going to pile rocks, as I've just shown, as I've done in my own pond indeed, at the edge, belt and braces, maybe not necessary, but I use offcuts of the liner, because when you've finished your pond, you probably will have offcuts, to put on top of my pond liner, just to give me an extra layer in case there's anything sharp on the rocks that I'm going to put in the pond. It's belt and braces, I know, but I will always line it, and if I don't think I'm going to have enough offcuts to be able to do that, I will order the liner deliberately a little bit oversized to make sure that I've got these offcuts so that I can put on top to protect my vitally important proper pond liner. Right, this video has gone on for quite a long time, and I do apologise for that, but I don't think there's any point making a video unless it's complete enough to be useful. So apologies for that. I'm going to start to wrap it up, except to say there's some of the most important points I have just not been able to even start to come on to in this video. The part 2, there may be a part 3, but part 2 I intend to cover basically where do we go from here. Having got a pond, where do we take it to? How can we maximise its benefit to wildlife? So I think I will be able to provide some useful input if you have a pond, whether it's newly built or you've had it a long time. Many subscribers, and I'm extremely grateful to you for subscribing, many subscribers are very experienced, but I think even for you, I might be able to show you 1 or 2 wrinkles which might improve your pond even further for wildlife, which won't be a bad thing. Also, a bit of troubleshooting, common problems, how to overcome them. Again, there's a lot of material, really good, useful material coming up in the part 2, so I hope you can join me for that. In the meantime, thanks ever so much for watching. If you would subscribe, if you haven't already, I'd be extremely grateful. That helps the channel. If you'd like it as well, click the like, thumbs up, that would help me as well. And I'll see you next time. Thanks ever so much for watching. Sorry if it's a bit long. I'll try and do better next time. Thank you. Bye.